Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Arthur Vance laughed as he poured the amber scotch over Elena's surgical award in front of the dinner guests. The liquid bloomed across the heavy parchment, turning the gold-embossed seal of the Royal College of Surgeons into a soggy, brown smear. The room, a cavernous dining hall filled with the scent of roasted lamb and expensive lilies, fell into a suffocating silence. The clink of crystal against the mahogany table sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. "A little moisture won't hurt a piece of paper, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. He set the empty glass down with a heavy thud and gestured toward the head of the table where Julian sat. "Besides, we should be celebrating real achievements. Julian closed the acquisition for the downtown redevelopment today. That is a legacy, not this hobby of yours." Elena Vance sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't reach for the ruined award. She didn't gasp. She simply watched the scotch drip off the edge of the table and onto the Persian rug. The hobby her father dismissed had required 12 years of grueling study and 20-hour shifts, but in this house, if it didn't involve a corporate takeover, it didn't exist. She looked at Julian Vance, who was currently adjusting his silk tie with a smirk that didn't quite reach his nervous eyes. He looked every bit the successful heir, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his wine. "It's a significant deal, Father," Julian said, his tone oily. He didn't look at his sister. "Though I suppose Elena could help out in the office now. She's always been good with charts. Maybe she could manage the filing for the new firm." A few of the guests chuckled, the kind of sycophantic laughter that fueled the Vance family ego. Martha Vance, seated to Arthur's right, delicately adjusted her pearls and looked away from her daughter's ruined commendation. She had spent 30 years perfecting the art of silence in the face of her husband's temper, a silent guardian of a legacy that was beginning to rot from the inside out. "Your father is right, dear," Martha said softly, her eyes fixed on her salad fork. "Julian is the future of the name. It's time you put these medical distractions aside and supported the family business. We all have our roles to play." Across the table, Beatrice Thorne narrowed her eyes. The older woman was the only one who didn't join the laughter. She was a fixture of the city's old money and the only witness to the true financial history of the Vance estate. She caught Elena's gaze for a fleeting second, her expression unreadable, before returning to her meal. Elena felt a familiar vibration in her pocket, a silent alert from her private encrypted line. She didn't need to look at it to know what it said. It was the confirmation of the wire transfer she had initiated an hour ago. For 3 years, she had been the sleeping lion of the family. While Arthur bragged about Julian's business acumen, she had been the one quietly funneling her surgical earnings and private investments into the family's hemorrhaging accounts to keep the lights on. They were eating off fine china and drinking vintage scotch only because she allowed it. The irony was a cold weight in her chest. Julian hadn't closed a deal today. He had signed a predatory loan agreement with a shell company to cover the $3 million deficit he'd created through gross incompetence and fraud. He thought he was saving himself. He didn't realize the shell company belonged to her. "I see," she said, her voice calm and level. It was the voice she used when explaining a complex procedure to a patient, devoid of emotion, focused entirely on the facts. "The legacy is very important to you, isn't it, Father?" Arthur leaned forward, the smell of peaty scotch and expensive cigars rolling off him. "It is everything. It is why I built this. It is why Julian will lead us into the next decade. You are a Vance, Elena. Start acting like one instead of playing doctor in a public ward." She looked down at the ruined award one last time. The ink was running now, the signatures of the board members blurring into illegibility. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her clutch purse, tucked under the table. It held the forensic audit of Julian's acquisition, a trail of doctored signatures and embezzled funds that would dismantle the Vance name in a single afternoon. "You're right," she said, standing up slowly. The chair scraped against the marble floor, a sharp, discordant sound. The legacy is exactly where it deserves to be, in Julian's very capable hands. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't look at the confused expressions of the guests or the triumphant sneer on Julian's face. She walked toward the foyer, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the stone. "Where are you going?" Arthur shouted after her, his voice booming with indignation. "We aren't finished." Elena paused at the heavy oak doors, her hand resting on the cool brass handle. She didn't turn around. "I have a surgery in the morning, Father. A very delicate extraction. I need to make sure I don't leave any dead tissue behind." As she stepped out into the cool night air, she pulled her phone from her pocket. She scrolled past the frantic messages from the hospital and opened a single, unsent draft addressed to the district attorney. 2 days. The countdown to the annual Vance Foundation gala had begun. 2 days until the world saw the real deal Julian had closed. 2 days until the foundation Arthur worshipped finally cracked. She climbed into her modest sedan, the engine purring to life, and drove away from the lights of the estate, leaving the ruins of her award and the illusions of her family behind in the dark. The next morning, the sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol and industrial floor wax offered a sanctuary the Vance estate never could. Elena Vance scrubbed her hands, the water scalding, as she prepared for her first consult. The rhythmic hiss of the automatic doors was the only warning she had before Julian Vance sauntered into the surgical lounge like he owned the wing. He looked absurd in his charcoal gray suit against the backdrop of functional linoleum and flickering fluorescent lights. "I expected you to be halfway to the airport by now," Julian said, his voice echoing off the metal lockers. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit, leaning against a pristine countertop and checking his reflection in the glass of a medicine cabinet. "Arthur is still fuming about your little performance last night. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Elena." She didn't look at him. She focused on the sensation of the rough paper towel against her skin. "I have patience, Julian. Unlike you, my day doesn't consist of moving numbers around until they look like a profit. Those numbers are what keep your name on the door of this hospital," he snapped, his facade of casual arrogance slipping for a fraction of a second. He walked toward her, the rhythmic click of his Italian loafers sounding like a countdown on the hard floor. "I'm here because Marcus Reed is asking questions. He heard a rumor that the foundation's liquidity isn't what the audit claimed. I need you to sign the medical endowment release. Today." Elena turned, her expression as cold as the surgical steel instruments on the tray behind her. "The endowment for the pediatric wing. That money is restricted, Julian. It's for equipment, not to pad the balance sheet for your merger." Julian let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Don't be naive. It's all Vance money. Besides, you owe the family. Who do you think paid your tuition? Who kept the lights on at the estate when the market dipped 5 years ago?" The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. Julian truly believed his own lies. He didn't know that Beatrice Thorne had come to Elena in tears 3 years ago, showing her the first signs of Julian's embezzlement. He didn't know that the anonymous donor, who had injected $4 million into the Vance Foundation to prevent a total collapse, wasn't a venture capital firm, but Elena herself, using the inheritance from her maternal grandmother that Arthur had never been able to touch. "I'm not signing anything," she said, her voice low and steady. Julian's face darkened, a vein pulsing in his temple. He stepped into her personal space, the heavy, cloying scent of his expensive cologne invading the clean air. "You'll sign it, or I'll make sure the board hears about your unstable behavior. I've already drafted the memo. I even used your digital signature on the preliminary intent forms for the Reed merger. Arthur approved it. You're already committed, Elena. Don't make this difficult." A chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning settled in her chest. He had forged her signature on a federal filing. He hadn't just been greedy, he had become reckless. "You used my name on a legal merger document without my consent?" she asked, her hand moving toward the pocket of her lab coat where her phone was already recording. "I did what was necessary for the legacy," Julian sneered, straightening his silk tie. "You're a Vance. Your name belongs to the foundation. Now get your pen. We have a gala to prepare for, and I won't have you embarrassing us again." He turned on his heel and marched out, leaving the door swinging in his wake. Elena waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before pulling out her tablet. She opened a secure file Beatrice Thorne had sent an hour ago, the real ledger from the Vance Reed negotiations. Julian hadn't just lied about the liquidity. He had promised Marcus Reed assets that didn't exist. He was selling a hollow shell, and he was using Elena's professional reputation as the collateral. She looked at the digital clock on the wall. 48 hours until the Vance Foundation gala. 48 hours until the delicate extraction she had promised her father would begin. She felt the weight of the evidence in her hand, a secret power that Julian was too blinded by his own reflection to see. The countdown had moved from days to hours. She pulled her surgical mask up, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, predatory focus. The surgery was still on schedule. 2 days later, the air in Beatrice Thorne's private study smelled of aged mahogany and the metallic tang of a heavy floor safe that had remained closed for a decade. The room was a sanctuary of old money, a stark contrast to the glass and steel monstrosities Julian favored. Beatrice stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the afternoon sun, as she handed a thick, cream-colored envelope to the woman sitting across from her. Elena Vance felt the weight of the paper before she even opened it. This wasn't just a document. It was a physical manifestation of her brother's undoing. Inside lay the original partnership agreement between Arthur Vance and Marcus Reed. The one Julian had claimed was lost in a server migration 3 years ago. "He didn't just alter the digital copies, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice like dry velvet. "He forged your father's signature on a secondary codicil. He's been diverting the Vance Foundation's endowment into a shell company called VR Holdings for 18 months. He isn't just failing at business. He's cannibalizing your mother's legacy to pay off his gambling debts in Macau." Elena ran her thumb over the embossed seal. The texture was cold, official, and damning. She had known her brother was arrogant, but the sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. He wasn't just a bad businessman, he was a parasite. "Does Marcus know?" she asked, her voice steady despite the roar of adrenaline in her veins. "Marcus Reed suspects he's being cheated, but he thinks it's your father pulling the strings," Beatrice replied. "He has no idea that Julian has been playing both sides against the middle. If this goes public at the gala, it won't just be a scandal. It will be a slaughter." Elena tucked the envelope into her slim leather briefcase. "That's the point, B. A clean incision. We remove the rot so the rest of the body can survive." The transition back to the Vance estate an hour later felt like stepping into a lion's den, where the lion was too busy admiring its own mane to notice the cage being built around it. The foyer was a chaotic symphony of event planners and florists. The scent of thousands of white lilies, Julian's favorite, because they looked expensive and funeral-adjacent, was cloying, thick enough to coat the back of Elena's throat. She found her brother in the library, standing before a floor-to-ceiling mirror. He was adjusting the lapels of a midnight blue tuxedo, his reflection radiating a smug, untouchable confidence. "There she is," Julian Vance said without turning around. He caught her gaze in the glass, a smirk playing on his lips. "The pride of the surgical wing. Tell me, Elena, do they let you wear such nice clothes at the hospital, or do you spend all day in those hideous green pajamas?" Elena didn't flinch. She set her briefcase on the desk, right next to a crystal decanter of scotch that cost more than a nurse's monthly salary. "The pajamas save lives, Julian. It's a novel concept, I know." He turned then, his eyes raking over her with dismissive amusement. "Save the sanctimony for your patients. I need you focused for the gala. I've moved your seat at the head table. You'll be sitting between Marcus Reed's son and the lead investor from the Dubai group. Smile, look pretty, and for God's sake, don't talk about work. These people want to be entertained, not reminded of their mortality." The audacity was a physical heat. He was ordering her around in their father's house, using her as a prop for a deal that was built on a foundation of forged signatures and stolen trust funds. "I'll be there," Elena said, her voice dropping to a calm, chilling register. And I'll make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve." Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that echoed off the leather-bound books. He reached out, patting her cheek with a condescending flick of his fingers. "That's my girl. Just remember, this gala is my coronation. Father is finally stepping back and the board is ready to name me CEO. Try not to look too jealous when they make the announcement." He walked past her, the scent of his cloying cologne lingering in the air. At the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Oh, and Elena. Don't bother checking the trust accounts for the next few days. I've had to optimize the liquidity for the Reed merger. It's all for the family, of course." He vanished into the hallway, his whistling fading as he headed toward the gardens. Elena stood in the silence of the library, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum. She reached into her briefcase and touched the edge of the forged contract. He had just admitted to optimizing the trust, a euphemism for the final stage of his theft. He was so blinded by the glare of his own perceived brilliance that he didn't realize he had just handed her the final piece of the puzzle. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Marcus Reed. "The documents are secured. I have the originals with the forged signatures. Meet me at the clinic at midnight." A moment later, the reply came, "I'm ready. Let's end this." Elena looked at the digital clock on the library mantel. 48 hours. The countdown was no longer a theoretical exercise. The stage was set, the witnesses were invited, and the scalpel was sharp. She looked at her reflection in the same mirror Julian had used. She didn't see a pretty face or a sleeping lion. She saw a surgeon about to perform the most important operation of her life. The Vance Foundation Gala wasn't going to be a coronation. It was going to be an autopsy. And Julian was the only one in the room who didn't know he was already on the table. The morning before the gala, the Vance estate was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. The foyer smelled of forced elegance and thousands of white lilies, a scent so cloying it felt like a funeral shroud rather than a celebration. Elena Vance stood on the mezzanine, watching the chaos below. Florists scurried with crystal vases, and the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of silver spoons against porcelain echoed from the dining room where the brunch service was being laid out. Julian Vance was at the center of it all, barking orders at a decorator who looked ready to bolt. He looked up and saw her, his lip curling into a familiar, practiced sneer. He adjusted his silk tie, the sapphire clip catching the morning light with a flash of unearned brilliance. "Don't just stand there like a statue, Elena," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the bustle. "If you can't be useful, at least stay out of the light. We have the governor coming tomorrow, and I won't have you looking like a somber governess in the background of the press photos." Elena didn't flinch. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand grazing the cold mahogany railing. "The house looks fragile, Julian. All this weight on such a thin foundation." He laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that made a nearby server jump. "Fragile? This foundation is stronger than it's ever been. I've secured more funding in 6 months than Dad did in 6 years. But I wouldn't expect a surgeon to understand the nuances of high-level philanthropy. You deal in blood and bone. I deal in legacies." "Legacies can be forged as easily as signatures," she said, her voice dropping to a calm, dangerous level. She stopped 3 feet from him, noticing the way his eyes darted toward his father, Arthur Vance, who was approaching from the study. "You should be careful. Sometimes the things we think are buried have a way of surfacing when the tide turns. If I were you, I'd check the clinic's ledgers one last time before the curtains go up." Julian's face didn't crumble, not yet. Instead, it hardened into a mask of pure, entitled rage. He stepped into her personal space, the scent of his expensive, spicy cologne clashing with the lilies. "Is that a threat?" he hissed, low enough that Arthur wouldn't hear. "Listen to me carefully. You are a guest in this house by my grace alone. Tomorrow night is my coronation. If you so much as breathe a word of your concerns to the board, I will make sure your medical license is as dead as your social life. Stick to your scalpels, Elena. Leave the real world to the men who know how to run it." Arthur reached them then, clapping a hand on his son's shoulder. "Everything ready for the big night, Julian." "Perfectly, father," Julian said, his voice instantly switching to the tone of a dutiful, successful heir. He shot Elena a dismissive look. Elena was just admitting she feels a bit out of her depth. I told her not to worry. She just needs to show up, look pretty, and try not to talk about the hospital. Martha Vance entered the foyer then, followed closely by Beatrice Thorne. Beatrice's eyes immediately found Elena's. There was no warmth in the look, but there was a sharp, jagged edge of recognition. Beatrice knew. She knew what Julian had done, and she knew Elena was the only one with the spine to dig for the truth. "Beatrice," Julian beamed, stepping away from Elena as if she were a piece of furniture he'd finished polishing. "Tell me the Thorne family is ready to see the Vance name restored to its rightful glory tomorrow." "We are ready for the truth to come out, Julian," Beatrice replied, her voice dry as parchment. She didn't look at him. She looked at the folder tucked under Elena's arm. Elena felt the weight of the forged documents against her ribs. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, jagged teeth of the key to the clinic's private archives. The warning had been given. The arrogant fool had not only ignored it, he had trampled over it. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the manicured lawn, Elena retreated to her room. She pulled out her phone and saw a single notification from Marcus Reed. "The projector is bypassed. The board members are all confirmed. The trap is set." She looked at the gown hanging on her wardrobe, a deep surgical red. Julian wanted a coronation. He wanted the world to see him as the savior of the Vance legacy. He had no idea that by this time tomorrow, the only thing the world would see was a thief standing in the ruins of a house he'd burned down himself. She sat on the edge of her bed, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the buzzing in her veins. The countdown was over. Tomorrow, the autopsy would begin. The evening arrived with a suffocating sense of opulence. The Vance estate's grand ballroom, usually a mausoleum of old money and quiet resentment, had been transformed into a shrine for a lie. The scent of white lilies, the kind that smelled like a funeral if one inhaled too deeply, clung to the humid air. Beneath the vaulted ceiling, the low hum of a string quartet struggled to compete with the clinking of crystal and the practiced laughter of the city's elite. Elena Vance stepped onto the polished marble foyer, the cold stone vibrating beneath her heels. She wore the surgical red gown she had chosen the night before, a bold, defiant slash of color against the sea of safe blacks and muted navy. She felt the weight of the small, silver flash drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her skirt. It was a tiny thing, no heavier than a coin, yet it held the power to incinerate every gilded pillar in the room. Across the crowded floor, Julian Vance was already holding court. He stood at the center of a circle of board members, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than a year of hospital supplies. He held a crystal flute of champagne with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had inherited the sun. When he spotted her, his smirk didn't even falter. He excused himself from the group and sauntered over, his eyes raking over her dress with visible disdain. "Red, Elena?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "A bit thirsty for attention, don't you think? I suppose after years of hiding in those drab scrubs, you felt the need to remind people you still exist." "I'm here to celebrate the legacy, Julian," she replied, her voice as steady as a heartbeat on a monitor. "Isn't that what tonight is about? Seeing things for what they truly are?" He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Tonight is about the future, my future. I've spent the last 6 months fixing the mess you and the old man let fester. The board is eating out of my hand. By the time I finish the presentation tonight, I'll be the youngest CEO in the history of the Vance Medical Group." He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence thick on his breath. "Do yourself a favor. Stay near the bar and keep your mouth shut. You're a nurse, Elena. Don't try to play at a table where you can't afford the blinds." She didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the strap of her clutch, her fingers grazing the jagged teeth of the archive key. "You're right, Julian. I've spent a lot of time in the trenches. It gives you a very clear view of the rot beneath the surface." He rolled his eyes and turned away before she could finish, dismissing her as if she were a piece of stray lint on his lapel. Elena moved deeper into the room, her gaze scanning the periphery. She spotted Arthur Vance standing near the grand staircase, looking every bit the king of a crumbling castle. He was deep in conversation with Beatrice Thorne, the family's long-standing legal counsel. Martha Vance stood a few paces behind them, her face a mask of porcelain perfection that didn't quite hide the tremor in her hands as she adjusted her pearls. As Elena approached, Arthur didn't even look up. He was too busy gesturing toward the massive projector screen that had been erected at the far end of the ballroom. "It's a new era, Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice booming with a hollow pride. "Julian has the vision I lacked in my later years. He's secured the expansion. The Vance name will be on every clinic from here to the coast." "It's an ambitious plan, Arthur," Beatrice replied, her tone neutral. She glanced at Elena, her sharp eyes lingering on the red dress. There was a flicker of something in her expression, not quite a warning but a recognition. "Elena," Martha said, stepping forward to bridge the gap. Her voice was thin, brittle. "You look striking, but perhaps a bit loud for a family event." "The truth is rarely quiet, Mother," Elena said softly. Arthur finally turned his head, his brow furrowing. "Don't start with the dramatics tonight, Elena. This is Julian's moment. I've arranged for the family photo to be taken after the keynote. You can stand in the back behind Martha. We need to present a united front for the press." The dismissal was so casual, so practiced, that it should have stung. Instead, it felt like a final, necessary confirmation. They didn't see her. They never had. To them, she was a utility, a safety net they could trample on while they reached for the stars. "I'll be exactly where I need to be, Father," she said. She turned and walked toward the back of the room, near the technical booth. Marcus Reed was there, blending into the shadows with the invisibility of a true professional. He was adjusting a headset, his eyes fixed on a tablet. As she passed, he didn't look up, but his hand moved subtly, tapping the side of the device twice. The signal. Everything was loaded. The bypassed projector was live, waiting only for the command. Elena took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, the cold condensation chilling her palm. She watched as the lights in the ballroom began to dim, a signal for the guests to take their seats. The excitement in the room was palpable, a predatory energy fueled by the promise of more wealth and more power. Julian stepped onto the stage, the spotlight catching the silver in his tie. He looked radiant, the picture of a savior. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hall like a gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate a name, we celebrate a rebirth." Elena stood at the very back of the room, her back against the cold stone wall. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a secret heart beating against her hip. She looked at the faces of the board members, the witnesses to the coronation that was about to become an autopsy. Julian gestured to the technician. "If you'll look at the screen, you'll see the true scale of the Vance legacy." The screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow over the front row. Elena took a slow, deep breath, her pulse steadying into a cold, rhythmic drumbeat. The countdown was over. The scalpel was in her hand, and the first cut was always the deepest. The silence that followed Julian's grand gesture was not the reverent hush he had expected. It was a vacuum, a sudden drop in pressure that made the air in the ballroom feel thin and freezing. Julian Vance stood bathed in the sapphire light of the projector, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the applause that never came. He didn't look at the screen behind him yet. He was too busy searching the front row for Marcus Reed's approval, his teeth flashing in a confident, rehearsed smile. "As you can see," Julian began, his voice booming through the speakers, "the projected growth for the Vance holdings under my new directive is—" A sharp, collective intake of breath cut him off. It wasn't the sound of admiration. It was the sound of 100 people witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Julian finally turned. The smile died so abruptly it looked like his face had been struck. Behind him, 30 feet wide and impossible to ignore, was not a bar graph or a revenue projection. It was a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer receipt from a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Below it, side by side, were 2 signatures. One was Arthur Vance's elegant, familiar script, The other was a clumsy, desperate imitation of it, dated 3 days after the patriarch's first stroke. Julian's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his skin turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray that made the expensive tan he'd gotten in St. Bart's look like a mask. His eyes, usually so sharp and predatory, darted wildly from the screen to the audience, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as a fine sheen of sweat broke across his upper lip. He tried to swallow, but his throat appeared to have seized, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively against his silk tie while his hands gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so hard the wood groaned under the pressure. His chest heaved, a frantic, shallow rhythm that suggested he was moments away from a total physical collapse. This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, thin reed. "A technical glitch. Elena, where is that girl? She sabotaged the file." Elena moved then. She didn't run, and she didn't hide. She walked down the center aisle, the heels of her shoes clicking against the marble with the steady, lethal precision of a metronome. The smell of expensive lilies from the floral arrangement seemed to vanish, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone from the projector. She stopped 10 feet from the podium. The board members in the front row were already leaning away from Julian, a physical distancing that spoke louder than any legal verdict. Marcus Reed looked at the screen, then at his hands, his face a mask of cold fury. Beatrice Thorne sat perfectly still, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips as she adjusted her pearls. "It's not a glitch, Julian," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the tomb-like silence of the hall, it carried to the very back row. "It's an audit." "You did this," he hissed, leaning over the podium, his face contorting into a mask of pure, entitled rage. "You're a nothing, a surgeon who thinks she can play at business. I'll have you stripped of everything. I am the heir. I am the Vance legacy." "You are a thief," she corrected him, her tone as clinical as if she were describing a tumor. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small remote, clicking at once. The screen changed again. This time, it was a video. It was grainy, taken from a hidden security camera in Arthur's private study. It showed Julian standing over his father's bed, holding a pen to the unconscious man's hand, forcing the nib across a legal document while Martha Vance watched from the doorway, her hand over her mouth but her feet rooted to the spot. A gasp rippled through the room. Arthur, seated in his wheelchair off to the side, let out a low, guttural moan of realization. Martha collapsed into her seat, her face buried in her hands. Julian looked around the room, but he found no allies. The witnesses he had gathered to celebrate his coronation were now the jury of his execution. He looked at Marcus, but the billionaire had already turned his chair away. He looked at the security guards, but they were looking at Elena, waiting for a signal. "You said I didn't belong in this family because I chose to save lives instead of stealing them," Elena said, stepping closer. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the cold blue light of his own undoing. "You were right. I don't belong in your version of this family, because in my version the legacy isn't the money, it's the truth." She turned her back on him then, the ultimate dismissal. She didn't wait for his excuses or his threats. She walked toward the exit, her head held high. "Elena." Julian screamed, his voice breaking. "You can't just leave, look at me." She didn't look back. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she paused just long enough to speak over her shoulder. "The police are in the foyer, Julian. I'd suggest you save your breath for the statement." She pushed the doors open and stepped out into the night, leaving the sound of his frantic, useless shouting behind her. The cool air hit her face, and for the first time in 5 years, she took a breath that didn't feel like it was borrowed. Behind her, the Vance legacy was burning, and she was the one who had lit the match. The gravel crunched under her heels as she reached the bottom of the stairs, the blue and red strobes of the patrol cars turning the manicured lawn into a surreal, pulsing landscape. Elena didn't stop until she reached the edge of the driveway, the metallic tang of the damp night air filling her lungs. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the Vance Manor swung open again, crashing against the stone exterior with a violence that echoed through the valley. Julian stumbled out onto the portico, his tuxedo jacket disheveled and his face flushed a deep, frantic crimson. He looked down at the 3 officers waiting at the base of the steps, Then his gaze snapped to her. The entitlement that had been his armor for decades was cracking, revealing the panicked child beneath. "Tell them," Julian screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at her. "Tell them this is a mistake. You're the one who's been handling the offshore accounts. Officers, my sister is delusional. She's been under immense psychological stress. She's making things up to spite the family." Detective Marcus Reed stepped forward, the light reflecting off his silver badge. He didn't look at Elena. He looked directly at the man on the stairs. "Mr. Vance, we have the digital signatures. We also have a witness who has been cooperating with the district attorney's office for the last 6 months." The front door opened again, and Beatrice Thorne stepped out. She wasn't the quiet, submissive assistant Julian had spent years belittling. She held a black leather-bound ledger in one hand and a USB drive in the other. She walked past Arthur, who stood frozen in the doorway like a statue of a forgotten era, and descended the stairs to stand beside the detective. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving only the rhythmic hum of the idling police cruisers. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to structurally fail. The arrogant tilt of his chin, a fixture of his identity for 30 years, collapsed into a trembling mess of loose skin and twitching muscle. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory calculation, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the dark woods at the edge of the property as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. The skin around his mouth turned a sickly, translucent gray, and a fine sheen of cold sweat broke across his forehead, catching the harsh glare of the sirens. His breath hitched in his chest, a wet, rattling sound that betrayed the total evaporation of his composure. He looked less like a scion of industry and more like a cornered animal realizing the trap had been set before he even entered the room. "Beatrice," Julian whispered, the name coming out as a choked plea. "I kept a second set of books, Julian," Beatrice said, her voice steady and devoid of the fear he had cultivated in her for so long. "Every bribe, every forged signature, every cent you drained from the employee's pension fund to pay for your gambling debts in Macau. It's all here, and it's all verified." Martha Vance appeared behind her husband, her hand clutching the pearl necklace at her throat so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She looked at her son, then at the handcuffs hanging from the lead officer's belt. For the first time in her life, she didn't move to shield him. She didn't offer an excuse. She simply stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the foyer, leaving her son standing alone in the light. Arthur Vance finally moved, but not toward his son. He walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on Elena. The patriarch looked smaller than he had an hour ago, the weight of his shattered legacy bowing his shoulders. "Elena," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment. You let this happen." "I didn't let it happen, Father," she replied, her voice as cold and clear as the mountain air. "I stopped it from being worse. If I hadn't stepped in, the entire company would have been seized by the feds next week. Now, only the parts Julian touched are rotting. The rest is mine." The detective moved up the stairs. The sound of the metallic click as the handcuffs locked around Julian's wrists was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. Julian didn't fight. He slumped, his knees hitting the stone steps as the officers began to read him his rights. The guests who had lingered in the foyer watched through the glass, their faces a gallery of shock and whispered judgment. The social standing Julian had used as a weapon was now the very thing that made his fall so public and so permanent. Elena watched as they led him toward the back of the lead car. He looked back at her once, his lips moving as if to offer one last insult, but no sound came out. The power he thought he held had been an illusion, a house of cards she had finally decided to breathe on. As the car door slammed shut, she turned to the detective. She handed him a small, silver key, the key to the private safe in the library Julian didn't know existed. "Everything else you need is in there," she said. She didn't look at her father again. She didn't look at the house that had felt like a prison for 5 years. She walked toward her own car, parked at the very end of the line. "Elena," Arthur called out, his voice desperate now. "Where are you going? The board," the family name. "What are we supposed to do?" She paused with her hand on the car door, looking back at the crumbling empire. "I didn't destroy the family, Father. I just stopped pretending you hadn't already done it." She slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As she drove down the long, winding driveway, the blue and red lights faded in her rearview mirror, replaced by the steady, white glow of the road ahead. She didn't know where she was going yet, but for the first time in her life, she was the one behind the wheel. 6 months had passed since the night the Vance empire began its slow, public collapse. Elena stood on the glass-walled balcony of the Mercer Surgical Institute, her new sanctuary. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of rain and harbor salt. She looked down at the digital tablet in her hand, scrolling through the final legal settlement. It was done. The fraud charges against Julian had been processed, and the civil suits from the fleeced investors had stripped the Vance name of every gilded asset it once possessed. "The board is waiting for you, Director," a voice said behind her. She turned to see Marcus Reed standing in the doorway. He looked different without the shadow of the Vance family's legal threats hanging over him. He looked younger. He held out a paper cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool air. "I heard the auction for the estate ended an hour ago," Marcus said softly. "The bank took the house. Most of the art is going to a museum in the city to cover the restitution." "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "It was never a home. It was just a gallery for my father's ego." "And Julian." Elena took a sip of the coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her. "He's in a studio apartment in the industrial district. He's working as a delivery driver while he waits for his sentencing hearing." B told me he tried to sue the Institute for a consulting fee last week. The judge dismissed it in under 10 minutes. She felt a brief flicker of the old anger, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. She had spent 5 years as a ghost in her own life, saving people who didn't want to be saved. Now, she was building something that actually mattered. Later that afternoon, Elena drove back to the old neighborhood one last time to collect the remaining boxes of her mother's journals from the gatehouse. As she pulled up to the iron gates, she saw a rusted, dented sedan idling by the curb. Julian stepped out of the car. He wasn't wearing a bespoke Italian suit today. He wore a stained, polyester uniform with a cheap logo over the pocket. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark, sallow circles that spoke of sleepless nights and cheap gin. The arrogant smirk that once defined his face had been replaced by a permanent, twitching scowl, and his skin had a gray, papery quality that made him look 20 years older. He hadn't shaved in days, the patchy stubble highlighting the new, hollow gauntness of his cheeks. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his reflection was the only thing he had left, and even that was failing him. "You must be happy," Julian spat, his voice raspy. He gestured toward the for sale sign being hammered into the lawn by 2 burly men in neon vests. "You destroyed everything. Father is living in a managed care facility, and I'm living in a hole in the wall because of your evidence." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. "You destroyed yourself, Julian. I just stopped holding the debris up for you." "We were family," he shouted, but the sound was thin, swallowed by the wind. Martha stepped out from the passenger side of Julian's car. She looked smaller, her designer coat hanging off her frame. She looked at Elena, and for a moment, Elena hoped for a spark of recognition, a sign of a mother's pride. But Martha's eyes were hard, clouded by the same stubborn denial that had protected Arthur for decades. "You should have just stayed quiet, Elena," Martha said, her voice trembling with a fragile, misplaced dignity. "We could have handled it. We could have kept the name intact. Now look at us." The words tasted like ash. This was the cost. Elena had won the war, she had secured justice for the people Julian had robbed, and she had reclaimed her own life. But the bridge back to her mother was a blackened ruin. Martha would always choose the lie of the Vance legacy over the truth of her daughter's worth. "The name was a lie, Mother," she said, her voice softening with a final, weary pity. "I'm the only thing in this family that was ever real." She turned her back on them, the sound of the auctioneer's hammer echoing from the porch of the great house. It sounded like a gavel. It sounded like an end. As she drove away, she looked in the rear-view mirror. Julian was standing by his rusted car, screaming at one of the movers who had accidentally bumped his shoulder. He looked small. He looked insignificant. Elena turned her gaze back to the road ahead, the white lines guiding her toward the city, toward the hospital, and toward a life where she no longer had to hide who she was to survive. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the weight of the Vance name pulling her down. She was just Elena, and that was more than enough.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.